Welcome, gentle listener, to a journey through the slow, silent corridors of history. A journey not of kings and crusades, but of kitchens and fields, of tables bare and bellies never quite full. Tonight you'll wander the forgotten byways of medieval life, where hunger lingered at every threshold, and the world's simplest pleasures, warm bread, a taste of meat, a cup of clean ale, were anything but guaranteed. If you close your eyes, you might almost smell the tang of wood smoke in a low-thatched cottage, hear the rough laughter of tired peasants sharing a meal of pottage, or feel the sharp edge of winter as it steals through drafty walls. Food in the Middle Ages was more than sustenance, it was struggle. Every bite was a small triumph, every harvest a gamble with fate, and every empty bowl a silent testament to the harshness of daily survival. What was it like, really, to live with the constant threat of scarcity, to eat the same bland fare day after day and wonder what the next season might bring? How did people find hope and meaning in such relentless monotony? In the centuries between Rome's decline and the dawn of modernity, Europe's tables were shaped by hardship, ingenuity, and luck, by soil and weather, war and work, faith and fear. This is not the history of knights and castles, but of the countless men, women, and children who toiled in fields, baked in communal ovens, and prayed for full barns. Their stories are slow-burning, sometimes dull, sometimes quietly moving. They are stories of bread made with sawdust, ale soured with time, meat salted to leather and eaten in celebration or desperation. They are stories of famine and feast, of loss and endurance, of ritual and routine that shaped the lives of millions. Tonight, you'll drift through a world where food was never taken for granted. With each story, you'll taste the dull bitterness of famine, the rare sweetness of plenty, and the unending struggle that filled the space between. Through it all, you'll hear echoes of your own table, of the ways we remember, honor, and sometimes forget the silent hands that feed us. As you listen, let your mind grow quiet. Let the dull, ancient rhythms of the past settle over you like a blanket. In the unremarkable details of daily life, there is a kind of magic, a slow, steady resilience, a hope that refuses to die. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to lose yourself in the slow, steady heartbeat of boring history. What can the forgotten food of the past teach us about gratitude, patience, and survival? Let's begin and find out together. You awaken before dawn, your breath frosting in the chill air of a one-room wattle and daub cottage. The darkness is still heavy, only broken by the gentle hiss of the banked hearth. You lie there, listening, and you know exactly what kind of day awaits. It is barley bread day, a day much like every other in your village. If you are lucky, the flour will last until the next harvest. If not, you will stretch what you have, mixing in peas, beans, or even the outer husks to eke out a few more loaves. Barley is not your first choice for bread. In truth, it is almost nobody's. It grows in rough, poor soils and is more forgiving than wheat when the weather turns. Wheat, with its sweet crumb and pale color, is for the well-off and the monasteries. Barley is for the rest. It is the lifeblood of the peasant, for better or worse. Before anything else, the day begins in the fields. In the dim light, you wrap yourself in coarse homespun and step out to tend the crops. The earth is hard. Your hands are rough, and every movement is methodical, a routine that has changed little for centuries. You weed, you break clods, you try to keep the birds away. If you do not, the coming year will be harder still. You think, as you work, about the risk of blight or rot. The previous year, a late frost meant a thinner harvest. The year before that, floods took most of the crop. Every season is a gamble, and it is a gamble you cannot refuse. The weather, the insects, the whims of fate, these are your constant companions. Barley is chosen because it survives where others fail. Its stalks are resilient. Its grains do not command a high price at the manor or in the town, but they will keep your family from starving. You think about the stories you heard as a child, of times when the harvest failed, when even barley would not grow, and families were reduced to eating bark or boiled roots. Those stories are not distant memories for some in your village. They are warnings. Once the barley is cut, it is left to dry in the fields. You gather the bundles by hand, tie them and stack them to cure. When they are ready, you thresh them with a flail, the dull rhythm of wood on stalk echoing through the short autumn days. The grain must be separated from the chaff, and each kernel is precious. After threshing, the grain is stored in sacks safe from damp and vermin. At least you hope. You recall last winter when a family down the lane lost almost everything to rats. The thin cries of hungry children haunted the village for weeks. When the grain is needed, it is taken to the mill. Your village mill is a low stone building by the river. The miller is a powerful man, for he controls the heart of the food supply. You wait your turn as the great water wheel turns, grinding the grain between millstones. Sometimes the miller takes a portion as his fee. There are rumors that he sometimes adds chalk to the flour, stretching it further, though no one dares accuse him outright. As you return home with your flour, you think about what it means. Flour is wealth. Flour is survival. You measure it out, carefully feeling its gritty texture between your fingers. It is nothing like the fine, pale flour that the reeve or the priest receives, but it will do. Bread is not just food. Bread is the centerpiece of every meal, the thing that binds families, neighbors, and communities. It is what you break with your loved ones. It is what you offer to a stranger at your table. In church, bread becomes the body of Christ, a symbol of hope and redemption, even for those who have precious little. Making the dough is the next step in the slow, careful process. You mix the flour with water from the well, hoping that the bucket did not dip too close to the muddy bottom. Sometimes you have a bit of leaven, a sour, bubbling starter saved from the last batch. More often, you must do without. The bread will be flatter, harder, but still filling. Kneading the dough is a chore that leaves your arms aching. You mix in a pinch of salt if you can spare it, or perhaps some herbs from the garden. Onion tops, nettles, maybe even a few beans or peas for bulk. If you are lucky, there may be a bit of lard or drippings left over from the last pig killing. Each addition is precious, a small luxury. The dough is shaped into rough rounds, set to rise by the warmth of the hearth if there is time, or baked quickly if not. Your oven is a simple clay dome in the corner, heated with bundles of sticks and rushes. There is no thermometer, no timer, only experience and careful attention. Too long, and the loaves burn. Too little, and they remain damp inside, risking mold. As the bread bakes, the cottage fills with a smell that is comforting if not exactly appetizing. Barley bread is dense, dark, and chewy, with a crust that can break teeth if you are not careful. Children complain, but you remind them that it is better than nothing. Bread, once made, is rationed carefully. Each loaf must last as long as possible. You think about the stories you heard from the old ones, of times when flour was stretched with sawdust or ground beans, when a single loaf was shared among a dozen people, and still there was hunger. You wonder, as you break the first loaf and share it with your family, about those who have even less. The beggars who come to the village door, the wandering poor who have lost everything. Sometimes you spare a crumb, sometimes you cannot. As the day ends and you prepare for the next, you are left with questions that linger. How will you survive if the next harvest fails? Will your children grow up strong on such meager fare? Can barley bread alone sustain a village through the long, lean months to come? Dawn gives way to the weak light of morning, and the village stirs as smoke rises from a dozen humble hearths. The routine is always the same. Each household guards its loaf carefully, watching the children's hands and the neighbors' eyes with equal caution. Barley bread does not last long, but it must last. You place the dense, dark round at the center of your table. It is rough, gray-brown, marked by cracks and the evidence of a rushed hand. With a blunt knife, you saw thick slices, sometimes two, hard to cut cleanly, and serve them with the day's meager rations. On good days there is a stew or pottage, the bread acting as both plate and utensil, soaking up every last drop. On worse days there is only bread. The children squabble over the crusts, the eldest trying to trade his piece for a softer one. You try to remember when you last had enough to feel satisfied, not just full. Barley bread is chewy and by afternoon, almost stale. Each mouthful requires effort, your jaw working against the thick crumb. The children gnaw, quieting only when the taste of a few wild herbs, perhaps a scrap of onion or garlic, breaks the monotony. It is not only your family that survives on barley bread. The whole village shares this ritual. Your neighbors' fortunes are tied to yours. You watch each other closely, but not unkindly. When a family's oven fails, the others lend theirs. Out, of necessity as much as kindness. On feast days or holidays, you pool your stores to bake larger loaves, sometimes in the great communal oven near the village green. The communal oven is an institution. Once a week, families line up, baskets and trays covered in rough linen. The baker, usually a widow or an elder with a steady hand, tends the fires and watches the loaves. For a small fee, sometimes just a slice, she ensures that each batch bakes properly. It is a rare chance for quiet talk and the exchange of news, the sort that travels faster than the carts that rumble through the muddy roads. Barley bread is currency as much as food. You use it to pay taxes to your lord, along with eggs, chickens, or labor. When the manor's reeve comes to collect, you offer him your best loaf, sometimes spiked with a handful of precious wheat or rye for appearance's sake. You know that your bread is judged not just on taste or freshness, but on how much care you can afford to show. The priest preaches about sharing and charity, but even he eats finer bread, his table graced with white wheaten rounds blessed by the monastery. You watch as he blesses your barley loaf for the poor box. It will be distributed eventually to those who come begging at the church door. Sometimes when the harvest is better than expected, the church will bake special loaves, sweetened with honey or studded with dried fruit, handed out to children on holy days. These are rare moments of joy, the memory of which lingers far, longer than the taste. Still, there are unspoken rules. When the grain runs short, you eat less. Children are sent out to forage. Nettles in spring, wild sorrel in summer, chestnuts and acorns in autumn. You grind acorns into meal and mix them with barley flour to stretch the bread, even though the result is bitter and heavy. Some years, even this is not enough. Disease too stalks the village. In damp years, the stored grain molds quickly, producing bread that is sour and sometimes dangerous. Ergot, a fungus that grows on wet rye and barley, can poison an entire family. You have seen the signs: hallucinations, fits, burning pains in the limbs. Some call it St. Anthony's fire. The church holds processions and prayers, but there is little else to do but wait and hope. Your mind returns to the mill, the ever-present hum of the water wheel, the dust that settles on everything. The miller is both a neighbor and a gatekeeper. His fee, known as multure, is often resented. There are whispers that he cheats, taking more than his due or mixing poor flour with good. But few can afford to challenge him. His trade is protected by custom and sometimes by force. If the bread is not properly baked, it can grow mold or harbor insects. Weevils are a common companion, their small bodies baked into the crust. The children sometimes pick them out. Other times they do not notice. You have learned not to complain. Preserving bread is another challenge. You store it wrapped in linen hung high from the rafters to keep it away from rats. Despite your best efforts, you lose some each season to pests and rot. When winter comes, the loaves become smaller, the slices thinner. You bake less frequently to save fuel, and the bread becomes harder, needing to be soaked in ale or broth to be edible. Through all this, you find community. At weddings, births, and funerals, bread is shared among neighbors, sometimes as a sign of peace, sometimes as comfort. You recall how, at a neighbor's funeral, every household contributed a loaf to feed the mourners. Bread, in these moments, is not just food but memory. On festival days, rare but welcome, the villagers gather to share what little they have. Bread takes center stage, torn and dipped in pots of spiced ale or thin stew. The oldest among you, those who remember times before the last famine, recount how things used to be better, or perhaps just different. Stories are passed with the loaves, each one an anchor to the past. Barley bread is, in every sense, survival. It binds you to the land, to your neighbors, to the seasons, and to the thin line between hunger and hope. But as you watch the last crumb disappear from the plate, another question gnaws at you. If the harvest fails, or the miller cheats, or rats break into the granary, how long before the bread and the sense of security it brings is gone? What happens to the village, to the people you know and love, when even the humble barley loaf can no longer be counted on? As winter deepens and the fields lie frozen beneath a crust of frost, the rhythm of your life is determined by how long the flour holds out. Barley bread, which began as a daily certainty, becomes more precious with each shrinking loaf. You ration it with care, watching the slow disappearance of the sack as the dark days stretch on. The cottage feels smaller, tighter, as everyone clusters near the hearth to share what warmth and food remain. Each meal becomes an exercise in invention. Bread is sliced thinner and stews are watered down until they are little more than broth flavored with bitter greens and stray roots. You make pottage, letting bread soak and swell to fill empty bellies. Sometimes you toast the hard crusts over the fire to coax out the last hints of sweetness and warmth. You recall in these times the stories your elders told, of winters when the bread ran out and people survived on little more than boiled bark or scraps dug from beneath the snow. These stories, grim as they are, bind the community together, reminding everyone that survival is possible, even when hope is thin. Barley bread, humble as it may be, is both an anchor and a lifeline. Its taste, coarse, sometimes bitter, is the taste of continuity, of hands that have sown, harvested, and baked in the same earth for generations. The land gives what it can, and when it fails, you look to your neighbors, pooling resources, sharing scraps, ensuring that the very youngest and oldest are not left behind. Hunger is an enemy best faced together. Even the church, with its distant rituals, is drawn into the cycle. On Sundays, the priest speaks of sacrifice and endurance. The bread at communion, white, wheaten, impossibly soft, seems almost otherworldly. For a moment, you wonder at the difference. One bread for the soul, another for the body. In the back of the church, poor boxes overflow with offerings of barley bread from those who have little else to give. Not all hardships can be overcome by bread and faith alone. In bad years, famine creeps through the countryside. The poorest, families are forced to beg or wander from village to village seeking work or charity. Some disappear entirely, remembered only in hushed conversations and empty doorways. The graveyard, too, fills more quickly, yet every spring brings hope. The first green shoots in the field are greeted with gratitude and prayers. When the mill reopens and the water wheel creaks back to life, you feel a cautious optimism. The first batch of flour is always celebrated, even if it is gritty and gray. You knead dough with new strength, and the aroma of fresh bread in the cottage is a balm, a promise that you have survived another cycle. Barley bread is not a symbol of plenty. It is a symbol of survival. Each loaf tells a story of effort, endurance, and community. You look back on the leanest seasons with a strange mixture of sorrow and pride. Hunger left its mark, but so did resilience. As you grow older, you pass these lessons to your children. You teach them to gather, to thresh, to grind, and to bake, not just to fill their bellies, but to remember where they came from. You show them the scars and the fields where the worst floods once ran, and you point to the stone bread oven, explaining how it has stood through fires, storms, and failed harvests. In quiet moments, you reflect on the simplicity of barley bread, how something so basic can shape lives and destinies. You remember how a single loaf could unite a family, comfort the grieving, or bring a village together in times of need. You wonder, as you look toward the future, if those who come after will know the taste of true hunger, or the satisfaction that comes from surviving it. For in the story of barley bread, there is more than just food. There is memory, tradition, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people. There is the lesson that while life may be harsh and resources limited, community and perseverance can make even the most meager bread meaningful. As another year ends, you ask yourself, when plenty returns, and it always does eventually, will anyone remember what it was like to rely on barley bread alone? Or will they forget the hardships that shaped your lives along with the strength that saw you through? As the loaf cools on the table and the last embers fade, the story of barley bread continues, a thread running through the generations, binding past and present in the simplest, most enduring act of all, breaking bread together. Imagine waking each day with the knowledge that everything in your larder, everything you and your family might eat, could vanish with a single change in weather, a faulty roof, or a few too warm afternoons. In the centuries before iceboxes, freezers, and canned goods, the battle against spoilage was a daily struggle that shaped diets, economies, and even empires. You stand in the middle of a medieval kitchen, the air thick with the smells of smoke, fermenting grains, and something slightly acrid, perhaps brine or vinegar. Hanging from the rafters, rows of fish, sausages, and bundles of herbs twist slowly in the updraft from the fire. On a table sits a wooden barrel, its sides stained white with salt. A few slabs of pork rest inside, each one turned and packed carefully, coated in the most precious mineral in the house. Salt is, quite simply, the difference between survival and starvation. With it, you can keep meat for weeks or months, preserving what would otherwise rot in days. Without it, you are at the mercy of the hunt, the market, or the generosity of your neighbors. In the Middle Ages, salt is so valuable that it is traded across continents, hoarded, and even used as currency in some parts of the world. Its importance is evident in language itself. Salary, salarium, once referred to the wages paid in salt. Your family might obtain salt by traveling to the coast to collect it from tidal flats, or by trading with salt merchants who have braved long, dangerous journeys across the Alps or along the winding salt roads. The salt they bring is often coarse and gray, speckled with grit and the scent of the sea. It is precious enough to be kept under lock and key, measured out with care. The preservation process begins the day an animal is slaughtered. Every scrap must be saved. Fat is rendered for tallow candles and soap. Intestines become sausage casings. Most of the meat is cut into manageable pieces and packed into barrels or stone crocks with layers of salt between each chunk. The salt draws out moisture and prevents the growth of harmful bacteria, though the result is often chewy, tough, and incredibly salty by modern standards. For fish, the process is even more essential. Herring, cod, and mackerel are split, cleaned, and rubbed with salt before being stacked in barrels. In towns near the sea, the entire community is involved in salting the catch. Men fish, women and children gut and salt, and merchants pack the barrels for market. Salted food is not just a necessity, it is a way of life. Recipes revolve around its presence and customs developed to make the most of every morsel. A hunk of salt pork might be boiled and served with beans, the broth drunk as a tonic against winter's chill. Salted fish, rehydrated and simmered with onions and stale bread, becomes a staple stew in homes from Norway to Naples. Every household has a favorite method for soaking, spicing, or stewing to tame the salt's bite. But salt is not the only tool at your disposal. Vinegar made from the fermentation of wine or ale is used to pickle everything from cucumbers to onions and even eggs. The sharp tang of vinegar preserves color and texture, turning garden excess into winter sustenance. Jars line the shelves filled with turnips, beets, cabbage, and the rare treat of pickled walnuts. The process is time-consuming and sometimes risky. A misstep can mean mold or spoilage, and there are no second chances once winter sets in. Smoking is another strategy, perhaps the most atmospheric of all. You might hang strips of meat or fish over a smoky fire, letting the aromatic haze work its magic. Hickory, oak, or fruit wood all lend their own character, infusing the food with flavors that evoke memories of harvest and hearth. In some homes, the entire kitchen becomes a smokehouse during autumn, and the scent lingers in hair and clothing long after the last sausage has been taken down. Fermentation is both art and accident. Cabbages are chopped and packed with salt into barrels to become sauerkraut. Milk is left to sour and curdle into cheese. Leftover grains and fruits are set aside for brewing or baking. The success of these ventures depends on the invisible world of bacteria and yeast, forces that are not understood but are respected. Every region, and sometimes every family, guards its own techniques, tricks for starting the best fermentation, secrets for avoiding spoilage. Not all efforts succeed. A sudden thaw can spoil a winter's store of salted meat. Jars might burst or mold might creep in under a loose lid. Even in noble houses where resources are plenty, food spoilage is a constant threat. Chronicles and household accounts from medieval Europe are filled with lists of losses: barrels of spoiled herring, cheese riddled with maggots, flour spoiled by damp. These struggles shape the rhythms of life. The calendar is built around harvest and preservation. Spring and summer are seasons of plenty, but also of frantic labor, preserving enough to last through the hungry gap of late winter and early spring, when the previous year's stores are nearly gone and new crops are still weeks away. You might not think of salt as exciting, but its presence determines what is possible. It influences trade routes, social customs, and even the outcome of wars. Armies that run out of salt soon run out of preserved food and their fighting spirit. As you tuck away the last barrel of salted pork, you wonder what the coming season will bring. Will the salt last until spring? Will the pickles and smoked sausages make it through the hungry months? What disasters or small triumphs await in the quiet, unseen struggle against spoilage? For now, you close the cellar door and hope for the best, aware that survival in these times depends as much on a pinch of salt as on luck, skill, and the quiet ingenuity of every household. But how did salt shape the wider world? And how did societies adapt when this essential mineral ran short or became too expensive for ordinary people? What happened when war or disaster disrupted the delicate balance of preservation and supply? Step beyond the kitchen now and into the broader world, a world where salt is not merely a seasoning but a treasure that shapes maps and marks the rise and fall of kingdoms. In medieval and early modern Europe, the simple act of preserving food ties together distant coasts, alpine villages, bustling ports, and even desert outposts in a vast and intricate network of trade. Travelers along the famous salt roads, like the Via Salaria in Italy or the salt routes of France, witness scenes unlike any you might imagine from a mere mineral. Caravans of mules and oxen wind through mountain passes, each animal laden with sacks of salt hewn from coastal pans or inland mines. At crossroads and bridges, toll collectors demand payment, sometimes in coin, sometimes in salt itself. The why? Price of salt is posted in every market, and its fluctuation can spell fortune or ruin for entire towns. If you live near a great salt works, such as the saline wells of Wieliczka in Poland or the marshes of the Bay of Bourgneuf, your life is shaped by this industry. Laborers toil in the damp, dark corridors of underground mines, chipping away at gleaming veins of rock salt, breathing air heavy with mineral dust. Others work in the blinding sunlight, tending vast salt pans, coaxing the sea to surrender its bounty through careful evaporation. Salt harvest is grueling and sometimes dangerous, but it pays, a vital part of your community's survival and prosperity. Yet most are not so lucky. In landlocked villages, salt is always scarce, and sometimes bitterly expensive. The more remote the settlement, the more precious each grain. Merchants and lords use their control over salt to levy taxes, gabelle in France for example, generating resentment, smuggling, and sometimes outright rebellion. In some years, entire communities are pushed to the brink by salt scarcity, forced to subsist on barely preserved food, or to risk illness by eating what they cannot safely store. For the poor, the story of salt is one of constant compromise. You learn to stretch what little you have, combining meager amounts with smoke, vinegar, or fermentation. Old bread is toasted and soaked, meat boiled to reduce the brine's harshness. You watch, with a mixture of hope and suspicion, as salt merchants arrive on market day, their wagons surrounded by curious crowds and sharp-eyed tax collectors. If you are a merchant yourself, your fortunes rise and fall with the shifting tides of salt. One bad harvest, one border closed by war, and your stores dwindle, prices spike, and rumors of famine spread. Wars especially are perilous. Armies consume salt as voraciously as bread or meat. Without it, rations spoil and morale collapses. Many military campaigns, whether the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, or smaller local conflicts, are decided as much by logistics as by sword. In cities, the story grows even more complex. Salted foods become a staple of the urban diet, especially among the working poor who lack land for gardens or livestock. Fishmongers and butchers compete for the freshest and saltiest wares. Street vendors sell pickled herring, salted pork, or preserved olives, offering rare bursts of flavor to those who cannot afford fresh fare. Taverns boast their own secret brining or pickling techniques, each one a minor claim to fame. But the science of preservation is imperfect. Not all salt is equal. Sea salt can be gritty and slow to dissolve, while rock salt, if contaminated, might introduce unpleasant flavors. Mistakes happen. The brine grows weak, barrels leak, or a hot summer ruins a winter's careful labor. The worst result is botulism or spoiled food, a hidden danger that brings sudden illness or death. Medieval sources are filled with accounts of bad meat at feasts or mysterious ailments blamed on fish that turned too soon. The anxiety of spoilage leads to a culture of vigilance and ritual. Salt cellars are checked and rechecked, brine barrels stirred and sampled, pickled vegetables inspected for bubbles or mold. Some families go so far as to use talismans or prayers to protect their food stores, mixing faith with experience in the never-ending struggle against decay. Meanwhile, regional and religious traditions shape how people preserve and consume food. In Catholic Europe, fast days and Lent require alternatives to meat, salted or pickled fish, beans, and vegetables. In Eastern Europe and Russia, the art of preserving cabbage as sauerkraut or cucumbers in brine becomes a culinary mainstay. In the Middle East, salt-cured lemons, olives, and cheeses are part of daily life, their sharp flavors a defense against both spoilage and monotony. Salt is not only practical but symbolic, a gift at weddings or births, a token of hospitality, a sign of wealth or status. To eat someone's salt is to enter into a pact of loyalty. To run out is a shame few wish to admit. Feasts and festivals center around preserved foods, as much in celebration of survival as in anticipation of leaner days ahead. But sometimes, disaster strikes. One year, a merchant's ship founders in a storm and the town's supply is lost. Another year, war blocks the salt road and prices double overnight. People scramble, improvising with ashes, herbs, or drying in the wind. Anything to hold back the ever-present threat of hunger. Salt, then, is more than a mineral. It is a force that shapes societies, underlies economies, and sets the boundaries of what is possible for every cook, merchant, or monarch. Even as new techniques emerge, like the introduction of sugar preservation in the late Middle Ages, or early experiments with ice cellars, the ancient struggle with salt, spoilage, and survival remains at the core of daily life. As you watch, the last rays of daylight filter into your cellar, illuminating the barrels and jars that are your family's insurance against the winter. You can't help but wonder, how did people manage before salt was abundant, or in places where it could not be bought at any price? What ancient methods, now forgotten, once helped our ancestors survive in the absence of this indispensable mineral? As the centuries wore on, the limits of salt, and the human ingenuity born from necessity, became ever more apparent. What did people do when salt was simply out of reach, or when preservation needed to last through especially lean or war-torn years? The answer lies in a tapestry of alternative methods, each shaped by the landscape, climate, and traditions of its region. In forested areas, drying and smoking took center stage. You might imagine a medieval family in Scandinavia or Russia, stringing thin strips of reindeer, beef, or fish, and hanging them high above a smoky hearth. The cool, dry air and constant drift of wood smoke created an environment inhospitable to bacteria. In the Scottish Highlands and Irish coastlands, peat-smoked salmon and haddock became iconic flavors, delicacies born of necessity, their aroma and color both protective and pleasing. Elsewhere, the sun was the great preserver. In the Mediterranean, you could witness figs, grapes, and dates spread across rooftops and terraces, slowly transforming into sweet, chewy morsels. Drying fruit wasn't merely a convenience, it was survival, especially in times when harvests failed or trade faltered. Tomatoes, peppers, and herbs would follow suit, strung into garlands and stored for the bleak winter months. Even bread might be baked to a rock-hard dryness, ready to be softened in broth or wine when needed. Fermentation, an art of patience and microbial mastery, became a lifeline. In Korea, earthenware jars of kimchi bubbled underground. In Germany, barrels of sauerkraut joined pickled beans and turnips in cold pantries. Fermented dairy, from yogurt in Central Asia to kefir and buttermilk in Eastern Europe, added protein and essential vitamins to diets often short on fresh food. Sometimes these foods were little more than necessity. At other times, they became the flavors most beloved by each culture, handed down for generations. In the Arab world and across North Africa, preservation by oil was an ancient skill. Jars of olives, sun-dried and packed in rich golden oil, could last for months, their flavors deepening with time. In the Levant, labneh, strained yogurt, was rolled into balls, preserved in oil and stored in cool, dark corners. Cheese, another triumph of preservation, ranged from crumbly feta to pungent blue cheeses, each relying on unique climates and bacterial communities. Salt was still present, but often in much smaller quantities, its scarcity stretching the creative limits of the people. Ash and clay, though less known today, also played a role. In parts of the Middle East and rural Europe, eggs might be buried in ash or clay, creating a protective seal against rot. Chinese century eggs, preserved in clay, ash, and lime, testify to the extremes of patience and chemistry in pre-modern preservation. Even grain storage was an art. Pits dug deep into the earth could protect barley or wheat from pests and moisture for months at a time. Not all methods worked equally well. A sudden thaw, a flood, or a hungry rat could spell disaster for a winter's stores. Each generation learned from bitter experience which methods worked best, and every community refined the art of knowing what to risk, what to save, and when to share with neighbors. As the early modern era dawned, the long struggle against spoilage entered a new phase. The age of exploration brought new goods, sugar, spices, coffee, and eventually canned goods, into the kitchens of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Sugar, in particular, became a revolutionary preserver. Fruit jams and marmalades, candied citrus peel, and sugared nuts not only added sweetness, but protected against decay in ways previously impossible for all but the wealthiest. The rise of glass jars and better ceramics made airtight storage a reality. And for the first time, foods could travel farther and last longer than ever before. Still, preservation was never merely about food. It was a marker of culture, of innovation, and of human resilience. The methods a family used spoke of its history, its region, and its values. The communal smokehouse or pickling barrel was a place for gossip, storytelling, and shared labor. Recipes, tips, and even superstitions passed from parent to child became a kind of social glue, binding together generations through the shared anxiety and triumphs of keeping hunger at bay. Even so, disaster was never far away. The harsh winters of the Little Ice Age, the destruction of wars, or the upheaval of a bad harvest could undo months of careful planning. Chronicles record not only the famines and the years without a summer, but the quiet heroism of households who somehow made do, who bartered for a handful of dried beans or shared their last smoked fish with a neighbor in need. By the 19th century, the world was changing. Canning, pasteurization, and eventually refrigeration would end the era of salt and smoke as absolute necessities. The daily dread of spoilage faded, replaced by new worries: overprocessed food, loss of traditional knowledge, and the alienation of modern supply chains. Yet, echoes of the old ways persisted in language, in taste, and in ritual. The Sunday. Ham, the holiday pickles, the hard cheese at the end of a meal, all are reminders of a time when preservation was survival. And so, the long story of salt, spoilage, and survival draws to a close, not with the triumph of one method over all others, but with the realization that every meal connects us to generations past. Every preserved food is a fragment of history, a monument to ordinary ingenuity, and a testament to the quiet battles fought in kitchens and cellars across the world. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you might ask yourself, What lessons remain in these old techniques? What do we gain or lose when food is always in reach and the rhythms of season, labor, and preservation fade from our daily lives? What stories do we carry in salt, smoke, and brine without even knowing? Imagine you are waking in a small, timber-framed cottage as dawn breaks on the edge of a medieval European village. Smoke curls from the hearth, and the air is thick with the earthy scent of damp rushes underfoot. A rooster crows, signaling the beginning of another day of toil. For most people in the Middle Ages, life was an endless cycle of labor, and what you ate reflected both your place in society and the rhythm of the seasons. Forget the banquets of kings and the colorful tapestries of courtly feasts. The average peasant's table was a far humbler affair, shaped by the land, the weather, and the whims of fortune. The diet of medieval villagers was not only plain and repetitive, but also a daily reminder of scarcity, hierarchy, and survival. Yet within this simplicity, you can glimpse the skills and endurance of ordinary people who coaxed sustenance from the soil year after year. Begin with the most essential staple, bread. In almost every region, bread was the backbone of the rural diet, so central in fact, that to earn one's bread became synonymous with earning a living. But not all bread was created equal. If you were poor, your bread would be dense, dark, and made with whatever grains could be grown or gleaned nearby. Barley, rye, oats, and sometimes beans or peas were ground together and baked into heavy, chewy loaves. The wheat bread enjoyed by the nobility was rare, white, soft, and prized as a status symbol. Flour was rarely sifted, and bread often contained bits of grit or chaff, leading to worn teeth and digestive troubles over time. In hard years, when grain was scarce, loaves might be stretched with ground acorns, chestnuts, or even the occasional handful of sawdust. A dangerous practice, but one that sometimes made the difference between hunger and survival. On the table beside the bread sat pottage, the near-universal stew of medieval Europe. Pottage was both food and strategy, a bubbling mixture of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were in season, simmered over the fire for hours or days. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and turnips were mainstays. Carrots, parsnips, or peas might appear in summer. In winter, dried legumes or preserved greens bulked out the pot. The flavor depended on what could be gathered, traded, or afforded. A dash of oil or a sliver of lard was a rare luxury, and most days, meat was entirely absent. If you were fortunate enough to keep a few animals, a pig, a goat, or some chickens, you would save their meat for special occasions. Eggs, milk, or cheese were more regular fare, but even these were rationed or bartered for other essentials. Hunting was risky business, as forests were often the legal property of lords or the crown. Poaching could mean brutal punishment. Fish, on the other hand, was a crucial source of protein in many areas. Rivers, streams, and even village ponds were carefully managed, and in some places, monasteries kept fish ponds to ensure supplies for both fast days and famine years. The seasons dictated nearly everything. Spring brought wild greens, nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, and the first eggs of the year. Summer offered berries, beans, and fresh vegetables. Autumn, the time of harvest, was a brief window of plenty: apples, pears, nuts, and the hope of enough grain to last the winter. Winter was lean, a time for dried peas, stored onions, hard cheese, and loaves baked so dense they could last for weeks. The monotony of this diet was broken only by feast days, weddings, or the arrival of a traveling merchant. Even then, celebration, foods, honey cakes, roasted meats, or imported spices were more often a tantalizing memory than a reality. Recipes were passed down by word of mouth, and women especially became experts at stretching scraps, thickening soups, and flavoring dishes with whatever wild herbs or old onions might remain in the larder. Salt was a rare commodity. In some places, the nearest salt market might be days away, and the cost was high. Most villagers relied on drying, smoking, or fermentation to preserve surplus food. Sauerkraut, pickled turnips, and dried apples found their way into many kitchens, while ale and cider, safer than the often polluted water, were drunk daily, even by children. And so, meal after meal, the peasant's table changed little from one year to the next. Hunger was a familiar companion. Malnutrition, stunted growth, and dental problems were common. Yet in the quiet resilience of daily life, you can sense a deep-rooted knowledge: how to rotate crops, how to store grain against rats, how to coax an extra handful of beans from poor soil. Behind every loaf and every bowl of pottage lies a web of relationships, neighbors trading eggs for milk, villages coming together for communal baking, or entire families gathering wild herbs along the hedgerows. Rituals and superstitions clung to food. Certain plants were picked only at dawn, bread loaves were marked with a cross before baking, and a small portion of the first harvest was set aside as an offering or blessing. As the day draws to a close and the fire burns low, the reality of the medieval peasant's table lingers. It was a table that rarely overflowed, but one that offered community, continuity, and a sense of place. It's easy, from the vantage of modern plenty, to dismiss this fare as grim or dull. But every crust of bread and every humble stew is a record of survival, adaptation, and quiet hope. Still, you might wonder, how did medieval villagers adapt when disaster struck, when harvests failed, animals died, or the Lord's taxes left the larder bare? What ingenious or desperate strategies did they turn to when faced with true hunger? And what stories of endurance did these hard times leave behind? When you imagine a medieval peasant's life, it's easy to overlook the sheer uncertainty and anxiety that shadowed every harvest and every meal. While the routines of planting, reaping, baking, and boiling provided a measure of stability, the threat of hunger was always close, a specter haunting even the most mundane activities. Scarcity was not a matter of if, but when, and survival depended on a quiet, relentless ingenuity. Picture the arrival of a cold, wet spring. The fields meant to be greening with grain are little more than mud. The seeds planted in hope refused to sprout. Perhaps the previous year's harvest was poor, and the stored grain in the loft has already begun to run low. Every mouthful becomes a calculation: how much to eat today, how little to save for tomorrow. In many villages, the months before, the next harvest were known as the hungry gap, a season when old stores were nearly gone and the first new crops not yet ready. To weather such times, peasants leaned on a deep body of local knowledge. Foraging was not a hobby, but a necessity. Families scoured fields and woodlands for edible plants: nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, chickweed, and the tender shoots of dandelion. These greens, sometimes bitter, sometimes surprisingly tasty, added vital nutrients and a splash of flavor to otherwise bland stews. Mushrooms, too, might be gathered, though with caution. Every village had stories of families who'd eaten the wrong kind. Preservation methods came to the forefront in these lean months. Dried beans, peas, and lentils were a hedge against disaster, lasting for months when kept safe from damp and rodents. Root cellars, holes dug deep into the earth, protected carrots, turnips, and parsnips from freezing. If a family was especially fortunate, they might have a few apples or pears from last autumn, shriveled but edible. Even the smallest amount of honey or animal fat was cherished, hoarded, and used sparingly. Yet sometimes, despite every precaution, famine arrived. Famine in the Middle Ages was not a rare event. Crop failure from bad weather, disease, or war could tip an entire region into hunger. Chroniclers recorded the desperate years with a kind of exhausted regularity. In 1315, the Great Famine swept through northern Europe, following months of unending rain. Grain rotted in the fields, cattle sickened, and people ate whatever they could find. Bark was stripped from trees, grass and roots boiled into thin soup. In these times, the social bonds of the village were tested and sometimes strained to the breaking point. Stories from these periods reveal both the hardship and resilience of ordinary people. In one English manor, records show the lord reducing rents and distributing grain during the hardest years, a pragmatic move for dead or desperate. Tenants meant uncultivated fields and lost wealth. In another case, a priest opened his church's stores of salted fish and dried peas to the village, making do without himself to stave off wider disaster. But not all acts of endurance were so grand. In countless homes, Mothers diluted pottage. With extra water, older children learned to ignore hunger pangs, and everyone shared what little could be spared. When bread ran out, famine cakes were baked from ground beans, peas, or even acorns. Hard, unappetizing, but enough to quiet an empty stomach. During especially grim times, communities came together for communal cooking. Ovens and fires were shared to conserve precious fuel. Sometimes whole villages pooled their remaining food for a single meager meal, ensuring that at least no one starved alone. Hospitality, however limited, was a duty. A stranger in need could expect at least a crust or a ladle of soup, a small gesture of solidarity in the face of hardship. Resourcefulness extended to the last scraps of food. Stale bread was soaked in hot broth or wine. Bones were boiled to make thin, nourishing soup. The resulting bone broth became a staple in many regions, providing minerals and flavor when meat was scarce. Cheese rinds, wilted greens, or even the fermented dregs of last year's beer were repurposed and stretched to their limits. The church calendar provided both constraint and opportunity. On fast days, which could include Wednesdays, Fridays, and whole seasons like Lent, meat and dairy were forbidden, further limiting already scant options. For the poor, who rarely had meat anyway, this was often just another day. But monasteries and abbeys sometimes distributed food to the poor on holy days. These moments of charity, however infrequent, could mean survival for the most vulnerable. Despite everything, life went on. The arrival of the first green shoots each spring brought hope, a reminder that even after the hardest winter, the earth could still yield food. Weddings, births, and feast days were celebrated, if only with a little extra honey or the rare luxury of roast meat. Children learned the lessons of thrift and patience, and the rituals of planting and harvesting wove each generation into the fabric of the land. Yet beneath this routine endurance, questions lingered. How long could a community withstand repeated years of scarcity? What happened when social bonds broke down, or when outside forces, lords, wars, or disease, pushed a village past its limits? What stories of loss, change, or adaptation emerged when hunger tested not just bodies, but the very structure of rural life? These questions would shape the next chapter of the medieval peasant's table, as communities adapted to the shifting realities of war, climate, and changing economic systems. If you settle into your seat and close your eyes for a moment, try to imagine the soft glow of a medieval hearth, the hush that settles over a cottage at dusk, the faint hiss of the stew as it bubbles. Barely enough for all. For the medieval peasant, the table was the center of gravity, the heart of family life. But this table was rarely heavy with food. It was a place of habit, of ritual, and of endurance, where hope and disappointment met, and where the quiet pulse of survival beat on year after year. Bread was more than food. It was symbol and sacrifice, faith and superstition kneaded into every loaf. Before anyone dared cut into a fresh round, a cross would be pressed into the crust with the back of a knife. Some whispered a prayer, "Let this bread never fail us," hoping that the simple act might keep hunger at bay for just a little longer. Sometimes the loaf was set on the table upside down by accident. A bad omen, people said, and a sure way to draw misfortune. So the youngest child would write it, and the meal would begin. On days when the bread was stale, hard as wood, impossible to chew, the old tricks came out. Bread soaked in broth, bread crumbled into the pottage, bread roasted over coals, just to soften the edges. When even these tricks failed and the last crust was gone, peasant families turned to the famine cakes, strange, dense rounds made from whatever could be gathered: beans, peas, wild seeds, acorns. The taste? It hardly mattered. Filling. The belly was enough. Each meal, even the most meager, had its ritual. The first bowl of stew was always served to the eldest, a gesture of respect, a silent nod to all the winters they'd survived. Sometimes a child would sneak a taste, scalding their tongue. Laughter, even in hardship, had a place at the table. Mothers reminded their children, "Eat slowly. You never know when you'll eat like this again." Children rarely listened. Around the communal oven at the village center, stories drifted as easily as the wood smoke. It was here, waiting for the bread to bake, that neighbors shared their news, their rumors, and their secrets. The oven was the soul of the village, a place where even the poorest could find a sense of belonging. Everyone waited together. Everyone hoped the loaves would rise. When a child was born, or when the harvest finally came in, the whole village came together to share what little they had. On rare feast days, a pig might be roasted, or a communal pot filled with everything that could be spared. For a few hours there was laughter and music, an old fiddle, a cracked drum, the steady rhythm of hands clapping. These moments of joy burned bright against the long, gray stretch of ordinary days, but hardship never vanished for long. When rain ruined the harvest or frost came too soon, a deep worry set in, heavy as a stone in the chest. Mothers counted out the beans, fathers eyed the dwindling grain in the loft, and children grew quiet, listening to the grown-ups argue in hushed voices. No one talked openly about starvation, but everyone felt its shadow. Even in these bleakest hours, ritual and belief carried families through. Some swore by charms, a sprig of rosemary above the door, a handful of salt tossed into the hearth. Others turned to prayer, lighting a precious candle before an image of the Virgin whispering, "Protect us, just this year." Hunger sharpened faith. Faith dulled the edge of fear. Still, the peasant table was not only a place of want, it was a place of memory, of connection, of stubborn hope. Recipes were never written down. Instead, they passed from mother to daughter, father to son, through stories and repetition, a certain way to stir the pot, a handful of wild garlic, a pinch of last summer's dried herbs. These details became the tapestry of family identity. "Like my mother made," they'd say, "like her mother before her." Even when there was little to cook, there was always something to pass on. Season after season, things changed in small ways. Sometimes a traveler brought news of a new crop, a different bean, a different way to plant. The slow spread of new foods like peas and broad beans meant a little more variety, a little more color on the table. Some years a market would spring up in a nearby town, bringing with it strange spices, dried figs, or a single wrinkled orange, a wonder to show the children, even if no one could afford a taste. But just as often, changes brought trouble. Lords raised rents. Merchants demanded taxes in coin, not grain. When the king called men away for war, the fields lay fallow, and the next year's harvest failed. Sometimes the changes were sudden, a flood, a fire, a sickness that swept through the cattle and left nothing but empty barns. Yet even when times were worst, the old habits endured. Bread remained at the center of life. A miracle, really. When you think of it, the act of grinding, mixing, kneading, and baking, it was a cycle that tied the present to the past, the living to the dead. Bread was broken, always shared. Even a beggar at the door might get a piece. "What goes around comes around," the old folks said. Someday it might be you with an empty bowl. Some evenings when there was a little cheese, a bit of dried apple, or unbelievable luxury, a spoonful of honey, the family would linger at the table telling stories, dreaming aloud. "Next year," they'd say, "next year will be better." Children would press their faces to the cold glass, trying to glimpse the future, their breath leaving soft clouds on the pane. Not all lessons came from joy. During lean times, children learned patience. They learned to scrape a pot clean, to eat the last onion, to drink thin, sour ale when water was not safe. They learned to be careful with hope, to cherish a sweet root pulled from the thawing earth. They learned that a meal, however small, was never to be wasted. If you visited a medieval village in late spring, you might see a crowd of children gleaning in the fields, searching for any grain missed by the harvesters. Their hands would be scratched, their pockets bulging with treasure. A few kernels, a wild plum, a bunch of bitter greens. These small acts of foraging, once necessity, now almost forgotten, kept families alive. At the church, the calendar brought rhythm and relief. Lent meant no meat, but sometimes it meant a handout from the monastery. A wedge of cheese, a bowl of pea soup, a few hunks of rough bread. On feast days, a miracle might occur. A neighbor bringing eggs, a friend sharing a jug of cider, a cousin returning from far away with dried fish wrapped in cloth. Time and again, survival depended on community. The family was strong, but the village was stronger. In times of famine, strangers might arrive with nothing but a story and a need. They'd be given a crust, a corner of the hearth, a place to rest. Kindness here was not a luxury. It was the rule. To turn someone away was to risk the anger of God, or perhaps worse, the gossip of neighbors. Over generations, the table's meaning deepened. As new foods arrived, slowly, subtly, the old ways persisted. Stews simmered for hours, filling the cottage with warmth and scent. Bread dough rose in wooden bowls covered with linen passed down for decades. Each year a mother's hands grew more skilled, a father's patience a little longer. Children grew, left, returned, brought stories of other tables, other lands. The cycle continued. It's easy from the distance of centuries to look back and see only the hardship, the endless labor, the hunger. But if you look more closely, listen to the laughter, feel the hush of gratitude before a meal, taste the pride in a well-baked loaf, you'll sense something else. The peasant's table was, above all, a place of resilience. Its legacy is not only the struggle, but the quiet triumph of making do, of cherishing small joys, of refusing to let hope be extinguished. So, as you return from this journey, this flicker of firelight, this aroma of boiling herbs and baking bread, ask yourself, what stories still linger in forgotten recipes? How many hands over centuries shaped the habits you follow without thinking? When you break bread, when you share a meal, what ancient echo sounds in your heart? And finally, in a world overflowing with choice, with abundance, what might we learn from the patience, the gratitude, the ingenuity of those long-ago families, gathered around their peasant's table, dreaming of better days? Imagine waking each morning to a world where almost every meal, every preserved fish, every morsel of meat depends on a small, precious handful of salt. Not just for taste, though the familiar tang was welcome on the tongue, but for survival itself. In medieval Europe, salt was not a kitchen afterthought. It was the line between bounty and famine, between health and hunger, and sometimes between life and death. It's easy now to overlook the strange power of this humble mineral. Open your cupboard, and there's the shaker, always full. But in the Middle Ages, salt was so valuable that towns sprang up around brine springs and salt pans, and great merchants built fortunes carting it along dusty roads or in creaking, sea-brined ships. Picture a peasant woman, let's call her Agnes, standing at her cottage threshold looking over the meager stores in her larder. Grain, a little cheese, some beans, and wrapped tightly in cloth, a lump of salt. Gray, rough, precious. She rations it carefully, each pinch a calculation. Will there be enough to last until the peddler returns from the market? If she salts her last herring, will there be enough for the pork at harvest? Salt isn't just for flavor. In a time before refrigeration, it's preservation, insurance against rot and disease, a shield against the endless hunger of winter. Imagine the annual slaughter. In autumn, when animals are butchered and the last of the harvest is brought in, families gather to salt the pork, the fish, the fat scraps destined for the coldest, hardest months. Children help rub salt into meat, their fingers numb, eyes watering from the sting. The work is hard, the air heavy with hope and anxiety. If the salt runs out, or if it fails, months of labor are lost, and hunger is certain. But salt is not free, and certainly not plentiful. In the north, where the sea pounds the coast and the wind stings the eyes, people boil seawater in vast, shallow pans, watching, waiting, as the precious crystals form. In the south, miners dig deep into the earth for veins of rock salt, sometimes working by candlelight in damp, echoing tunnels. Everywhere, salt is guarded, measured, and often taxed, Rulers know its value, oh how they know. Kings and lords levy salt taxes on their people, building roads, walls, even entire towns on the revenues. Some monarchs grow rich from their gabelle, the hated salt tax that crushes peasants and merchants alike. Smugglers, faux sauniers, risk their lives and their freedom to sneak untaxed salt across borders and through forests, chased by guards, praised by the EA. Desperate. In salt as in grain, power is always just one step away from hardship. In daily life, salt marks the rhythms of eating and survival. To preserve herring, so common in northern Europe that it was called the silver of the sea, barrels of fish are layered with salt, sealed tight and sent off to market. If you live inland, salt fish is a blessing and a curse. It keeps hunger away, but the flesh is tough, chewy, and sometimes almost unbearably salty. Peasants soak it for hours, change the water again and again, praying that the taste will mellow. It isn't just fish. Pork is salted, hung from the rafters, and if the air stays cold, lasts until spring. In lean years, even this is rare. The rest of the time, cheese and butter are salted too, hardening into sturdy wheels or lumps that can withstand months of waiting. Salt is the difference between a full winter and a hungry one, between a marketable product and spoiled, useless food. Salt is also medicine. Women mix salt with honey and herbs to soothe a sore throat or clean a wound. Midwives rub a pinch into newborn skin, believing it will keep away evil spirits or at least disease. It is currency, blessing, and sometimes curse. Salt travels. Caravans haul it across France and Germany, down from the Alps or from the marshes of the Atlantic. It's so valuable that it sparks wars. Yes, wars over salt. Towns rise and fall. Fortunes are won and lost, all for the sake of a mineral that most of us take for granted. In church, salt has another role. Priests sprinkle it in holy water, bless it, and use it in rituals. Superstition clings to it. Spill the salt, and you must toss a pinch over your left shoulder, or risk the devil's attention. Salt is so woven into daily life that its absence is unthinkable. Yet for the poor, salt is sometimes little more than a dream. In harsh years, when taxes rise and the peddler doesn't come, even a scrap of it is cause for celebration. Some peasants, desperate, try to preserve meat with too little salt. When spring comes, the stench of spoilage lingers in the air, a reminder that fortune and salt are never guaranteed. Markets are places of barter and argument with sacks of grain traded for a measure of salt, quarrels erupting over purity, weight, and price. For many families, salt is the only thing worth hiding, locked away in chests or hidden beneath the floorboards, safe from thieves and greedy officials. Children are warned, don't talk about the salt. You never know who's listening. Sometimes the lack of salt shapes entire cuisines. In landlocked villages, food is bland, preserved with vinegar, smoke, or sometimes nothing at all. In coastal places, salt is almost a birthright, but even then it comes at a cost. Some families earn their living by gathering, boiling, or mining salt. Others pay for it with what little they have. Always the need is the same. A pinch. Just a pinch more. The rhythms of the seasons dictate everything. As autumn deepens, families gather for the slaughter. The sound of axes, the smell of blood and brine, the work of many hands. These are the markers of time, the grim assurance that winter can be endured, if only the salt holds out. For those who can't afford enough, the consequences are real and immediate. Sickness spreads. Children grow thin, cough through the long winter nights, their bodies craving what is missing. In monasteries and great houses, the larders are full, the salted meat rich and plentiful, but outside, in the thatched cottages and smoky huts, every grain of salt is precious, every meal a gamble. Even the rituals of faith cannot escape salt's grip. Lent arrives, and with it, the old fasts, meat forbidden, fish allowed, if it can be preserved. Salted fish becomes daily fare and for some a dreaded monotony. Still, it's better than nothing. You might think salt is just an ingredient, just a flavor, but in the medieval world, it's the silent engine that drives economy, health, tradition, and hope. Its story is hidden in every barrel of fish, every slab of bacon, every carefully guarded larder. So next time you taste a grain of salt, on bread, on meat, on the tip of your tongue, consider this. How many lives, how many fortunes turned on this humble crystal? How many families counted out their meals, their years, their very hopes in pinches and handfuls? And what happened when the salt ran out? Salt. The word alone could spark hope or anxiety across entire villages. In the medieval world, its power stretched well beyond the kitchen table. Salt-shaped borders decided fates and determined who prospered and who struggled through another relentless winter. Imagine the great salt roads of Europe, lines drawn across the land by necessity, not choice. Caravans of donkeys, creaking. Wagons. Merchants in heavy cloaks trudge for miles under gray skies, all to move what seems like nothing more than coarse, pale crystals from distant coasts and salt mines into the hungry heart of every inland settlement. The Via Salaria of Italy, the old salt road of Germany, the winding trade routes that stitched France together. Salt was their reason, their lifeblood, their curse. Along these roads, towns rose up, at crossroads, river crossings, mountain passes, prosperous not because of fields or factories, but because they stood between salt and the people who needed it. In the bustling port of Lüneburg, vast mounds of white salt gleamed in the sunlight, the reward of laborers who dug for hours beneath the earth, emerging exhausted, skin caked in salt, eyes burning from the sting. In the south, in Venice and Genoa, salty cargoes arrived by ship, hauled in from evaporation pans or far-off mines, bound for the tables and pantries of Europe's hungry masses. But these great rivers of salt brought more than food security. They brought danger, greed, and often violence. Salt was so valuable that kings declared it a royal monopoly. In France, the gabelle, the dreaded salt tax, became both a source of royal income and a lightning rod for popular fury. People hated the tax so much that some risked everything just to avoid it, smuggling salt over fields and streams by moonlight, always fearful of the king's salt officers and their brutal justice. You can almost feel the tension at a border crossing, deep in a dark forest. The hush of night broken by the crunch of leaves underfoot, the nervous whispers of smugglers, faux sauniers, hauling sacks on their backs. Every movement is a gamble. If they're caught, there's prison, or worse. But if they succeed, maybe their families will eat this winter. Maybe a little extra coin will find its way into the ragged purse at home. The risk is worth it, or at least it feels that way when your children are hungry. Inside the cities, salt became a measuring stick of privilege and power. Nobles and abbots bought their salt by the barrel, storing it in cool, dry cellars. In the kitchen, servants worked carefully, preserving vast haunches of venison, barrels of fish, even sweetmeats and fruits. For the rich, salt was abundant. Their tables overflowed with well-seasoned roasts, pies, sauces, even salted sweets. In contrast, a poor laborer, a widow, a lone craftsman, they rationed every grain. For some, the luxury of a salted meal was a memory from a better year. Listen to the marketplace on a cold autumn morning. Barter is everywhere. How much for a cup of salt? Will you trade it for eggs, for wool, for a promise? Arguments erupt over purity. Is the salt gray, white, pink, or full of sand? Will it last or will it spoil the meat? Some merchants, more honest than others, sell salt cut with ashes or dust. It's a game of trust and suspicion, because a bad batch can spell disaster for a whole family. Salt shaped the flavor and nature of food itself. In England, France, Germany, Poland, wherever people lived, they developed recipes that made the most of what little salt they could afford. Herring, the silver of the sea, was so important that whole economies turned on its catch, its preservation, its trade. In Lent, when the church forbade meat, salted fish was a lifeline, but for the poor, it was often so briny and tough, soaking it didn't help much. Still, it was food. Sometimes, that was enough. Consider the monastery kitchens, their orderly routines built on prayer, silence, and the careful storage of food. Here, salt was handled with reverence. The cellarer, the monk in charge of stores, counted every sack, every measure, checking the walls for leaks or damp that could ruin the precious supply. For the sick, the old, or the young, salt was given sparingly, just enough to keep the balance between nourishment and risk. The very language of salt crept into medieval culture and law. To be worth your salt was to earn your keep. To be paid salary was to be compensated with, literally, salt. The ties between the mineral and human dignity were everywhere, invisible but unbreakable. But as the centuries turned, the cost of salt continued to rise. Sometimes whole regions rebelled. In 1548, in France, the salt tax pushed peasants and merchants to the brink. Crowds gathered, shouting for justice, attacking royal warehouses, even burning the records of the salt officers. The king's men fought back, of course, but the wounds ran deep. For many, the memory of hunger and injustice lingered for generations. In other places, salt was a force for progress. The great salt works at Salzburg, at Wieliczka in Poland, at Hallstatt in Austria, these places became wonders of engineering and endurance. Miners tunneled for days through solid rock, their faces and hands scarred by years of labor. Sometimes the mine collapsed, burying workers alive. Sometimes toxic gases or water bursts swept through, ending lives in an instant. Yet the work continued because it had to. Salt meant survival, not just for a family but for entire towns. The church, ever present in medieval life, saw salt as sacred. Priests sprinkled it into holy water, a sign of purification. In baptism, a grain of salt touched a baby's tongue, a blessing against evil, a wish for wisdom. But even the church could not escape salt's darker side. Abbeys paid taxes, monks quarreled over storage, and sometimes the lack of salt meant going hungry, just like anyone else. Not even kings were immune to salt's influence. The English crown regulated salt works, taxed the merchants, and sometimes seized supplies in times of war. The Spanish kings grew rich off salt from the mines of Cardona and the salt pans of Ibiza. In the Mediterranean, fleets of ships moved, salt across the sea, feeding cities from Barcelona to Constantinople. Sometimes storms or piracy would interrupt the flow, and every time the salt grew scarce, prices soared, fear spread, and everyone, rich and poor, felt the tension. For ordinary people, the search for salt became a part of daily life. Housewives gathered by the market gates, clutching coins or baskets of goods to barter. Children listened for news of the salt cart's arrival. Would it come this week, or would they have to wait another day, another meal without seasoning, without safety? In the darkest winters, salt could mean the difference between life and death. It was hope and sometimes heartbreak. As towns grew and cities swelled, the demand for salt only increased. Artisans needed it for tanning leather, dyeing cloth, glazing, pottery. Doctors prescribed it in medicines. Soldiers needed it for their rations. The web of need, production, and trade stretched ever farther, connecting distant villages to powerful kingdoms, and everyone felt its pull. What would happen if salt disappeared? If the mines flooded? If the salt pans dried up? If a king's army blocked the trade routes? For some it happened: famine, disease, hardship, sometimes even collapse. In the fragile, interconnected world of medieval Europe, salt was a thin, shining thread, holding life together. So tonight, as you imagine those lonely salt roads, the weary miners, the hopeful mothers, and the endless, necessary flow of salt, from sea and earth to table, consider this. How did this simple mineral, so easily overlooked today, become a source of so much struggle, so much longing, and so much resilience? How did salt shape not just the meals but the destinies of everyone who lived in those ancient days? And what happened when the power of salt was challenged, when new forces, new discoveries, and new ambitions began to shift the world's balance? Salt. It had always been there, a steady, silent force. Yet by the later Middle Ages, change was stirring in Europe, and the grip of salt began to loosen, little by little, with every discovery, every war, and every hungry mouth. The world was growing. Towns swelled into cities. Merchants armed with ledgers and ambition looked beyond their dusty, time-worn roads. The sea, long a barrier, became a promise. Ships, bigger, braver, bolder, set out for distant lands. New sources of salt appeared, distant mines, salt marshes, and vast pans cut into the earth. With them came new fortunes and new conflicts. In Buisson-de-Butte, France, the hated gabelle ground on, breeding resentment and defiance. In the salt marshes of the West, whole families became smugglers, children running ahead to warn of approaching officers, mothers baking secret stashes into loaves of bread, fathers moving at night silent as shadows, risking prison, humiliation, even the scaffold. For some, the risk was too great. For others, it was a matter of pride. There was honor in defiance, however dangerous. A single pinch of salt, untaxed, tasted sweeter than gold. Across the Channel in England, kings juggled laws and privileges, granting salt rights to loyal lords, then revoking them when the treasury ran dry. But no law could truly tame the tides or the taste for freedom. In the coastal villages, men worked the pans with bare feet and blistered hands, raking salt from the brine under a heavy sun, their faces red and cracked from wind and work. Farther, inland, the salty springs of Cheshire gave life to towns whose only purpose was to boil, bag, and barter. Trade brought its own perils. Pirate ships haunted the North Sea, preying on salt barges heavy with their shining cargo. More than one sailor's life ended with the salt, lost to the depths, while their families mourned, waiting on shore for ships that never returned. Sometimes, storms wiped out whole harvests. Sometimes, disease swept through the crowded, sweaty saltworks. For every fortune built, there were 10 that ended in sorrow. The old ways, too, began to shift. Science was creeping in, slow but sure. Alchemists, curious and tireless, tinkered with brines and minerals. In Venice, Genoa, Barcelona, ports that owed their wealth to the salt trade, merchants funded experiments desperate to find cheaper, faster ways to make their fortunes. Knowledge flowed alongside goods, recipes for new ways to cure meat, new methods for making cheese, even early ideas about how salt preserved life, not just food. Yet for most, salt's value remained stubbornly real. The taste of salted fish, chewy, briny, tough, was the taste of survival. The smell of hams hanging in a smoky kitchen, the scratch of salt under fingernails after a long day's work, the sharp sting in a cut washed with brine, these were the small daily markers of hope. It's easy now to miss their weight. Then, every grain was a promise. But the world was changing. The age of exploration, how the very words glimmer with the thrill and terror of the unknown. Sailors, hungry for profit and driven by dreams, braved seas no European had crossed before. What did they find? New islands, strange lands, and sometimes vast, blinding salt flats, where salt was so abundant it lay in thick sheets, white as snow, under an unforgiving sun. Suddenly the old salt monopoly seemed vulnerable. There was more salt than anyone had imagined if only you could get to it. The flow of salt changed, and with it, the world. Suddenly, cities that had once been rich from their salt lost their edge. Whole families, generations deep in the trade, found themselves outmaneuvered by distant suppliers. Old rights, carefully negotiated and defended, were swept aside by ships, by taxes, by war. A new global economy was dawning, and salt, still vital, was now only one current in a sea of trade. Yet even as the old power of salt faded, its legacy lingered. In language, in custom, in the slow, careful hands of a peasant woman salting her winter's pork. In the stories passed down, tales of brave smugglers, cruel tacksmen, desperate bargains struck in the dark. In the rhythms of the year, when in the damp cold of autumn, families still gathered to preserve their food, to work together, to hope. Salt had shaped lives, towns, whole nations. It had been a source of power and division, but also of community, survival, and faith. In the end, perhaps salt's greatest gift was not just preservation but connection, a reminder that all people, rich and poor, needed the same small thing to endure. Pause just a moment. Think of the countless hands that mined, gathered, traded, and scattered salt over centuries. Imagine the children sneaking pinches from hidden stores, the mothers who measured every grain with love and worry, the fathers whose fortunes rose and fell with every harvest and every storm. Think of the rulers counting barrels and coins, forever seeking new ways to tax and control, and the rebels, the smugglers, the simple folk who fought quietly, stubbornly, for the right to season their own food in their own homes. By the end of the medieval era, salt's power was still real, but the world was no longer ruled by it alone. Trade, science, and innovation were loosening its grip. Yet, even as new commodities rose to power, spices, sugar, tobacco, tea, salt remained. A necessity, a link to the past, a symbol of endurance. Today we hardly notice salt's story. It's in every kitchen, every table. Yet if you look close, if you remember the struggles and triumphs, the petty arguments and the great journeys, the sacrifices and the small victories, salt becomes something more. It is a monument to survival, a record of resilience, a testament to the ways ordinary people, in the face of hardship and want, found ways to adapt, endure, and, yes, hope. So, the next time you reach for a pinch of salt, remember, your meal is only the latest chapter in a long, hard, human story, a story built on salt, sweat, and centuries of survival. What new needs, what new discoveries, would shape the centuries to come, and what humble, everyday thing, like salt, might one day tell the story of our own age. Water, clear, cold, and utterly essential. In our own time, it's easy to forget how hard-won clean water was for our ancestors. But in the Middle Ages, water could be both salvation and threat. Its presence, or its absence, shaped the fate of villages, towns, and every soul within them. Imagine for a moment standing in a dusty medieval lane at dawn. The air is crisp, still scented with the smoke of last night's hearths. Women and children bundled against the chill, file quietly past, wooden buckets swinging from rope handles. Their destination? The village well, the lifeline of their community. Each day begins the same way, with hope, patience, and a little anxiety. Would the water be sweet? Or would it run brackish, green? Or, worst of all, not at all? For peasants, the well was more than a source of water. It was the heart of daily life, a place of news, gossip, warnings, even comfort. Old friends met at the stone wall, exchanging stories as they waited for their turn. Children leaned dangerously, over the edge, peering into the cool, dark depths below, daring each other to spit and watch it vanish into the black. If the rope snapped or the bucket fell, there'd be muttering, laughter, sometimes even tears. Yet for all its centrality, the well was also a source of endless worry. Medieval wells were shallow, unprotected, and easily fouled. Rainwater could bring in mud, animal droppings, even human waste. A dead rat, a broken egg, a bit of trash. Any of these might linger unseen, tainting the water with sickness. Without understanding germs, villagers made sense of outbreaks in other ways. A curse, a bad wind, or the anger of a neglected saint. Sometimes a whole village fell ill, and people would mutter darkly about poisoners or witches. Those who lived near, streams or rivers, had another set of challenges. Running water seemed safer, and for many it was the only option. But upstream, just out of sight, someone might be washing clothes, emptying chamber pots, or even butchering animals, sending blood and filth swirling downstream. Towns, especially, faced this risk. Rivers like the Thames, the Seine, and the Tiber, so vital to commerce, became open sewers. At low tide, the stench rose like a curse, and the risk of disease multiplied. Yet water was not just for drinking or cooking. It was woven into every ritual, every effort to keep body and home clean, or at least less filthy. Bathing, in theory, was a virtue, even a pleasure. Public bathhouses dotted the cities of Europe, from London to Prague, and the air inside was thick with steam and the murmur of quiet voices. Some bathhouses were simple affairs: wooden tubs, a warm hearth, a bucket of hot water poured over the head. Others were ornate, with marble floors, heated pools, and separate chambers for men and women, at least in theory. For many, though, the bathhouse was out of reach. The poor, most people, bathed at home when they could, with a pot of water, warmed over the fire. A full bath was rare. More often, it was a quick splash to the face, a scrub of hands and feet, a desperate effort to rinse away the grime of labor and living in close quarters. Hair was rinsed on festival days, children were dunked at midsummer, and babies were washed only when necessary. It wasn't just laziness, it was survival. Hot water was precious, soap expensive, and privacy impossible. And yet, for all the filth and danger, medieval people were not indifferent to cleanliness. They did what they could. They swept their homes, changed their rushes, and scoured pots and pans with ashes. In monasteries, strict routines dictated frequent washing, even if the water was cold and the soap harsh. In cities, barbers doubled, as bath-keepers, offering a shave, a haircut, and a bowl of hot water for a small fee. Water was never taken for granted, but the risks remained. Epidemics swept through cities and towns with fever, dysentery, and other fluxes as common as rain. During outbreaks, public wells and fountains were watched anxiously. If sickness started in one house and spread to neighbors, suspicion grew. People blamed outsiders, the poor, the Jews, or women who lived alone, anyone who seemed different, unlucky, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. In some places, accused well poisoners faced mob justice, punishment swift, brutal, and usually wrong. Medieval rulers tried to help sometimes. Kings and city councils passed ordinances. Don't throw waste into the river, don't dump animal guts near the well, don't wash clothes or slaughter pigs within the city walls. But enforcement was rare, and necessity trumped law. A poor widow could not haul water from the far side of town. A butcher had to work near the market. By nightfall, the rules dissolved and survival returned to the center. Even so, not all was bleak. Some communities built covered wells, with wooden roofs and locks to keep animals and children out. Others dug channels to bring spring water from higher ground. In great cities, engineers designed aqueducts, fountains, and public cisterns. Ambitious works, fragile but inspiring. The Roman aqueducts in southern France and Italy, inherited from ancient times, were still prized, still guarded. When they failed, people grieved, but they tried to repair them, to remember what clean water could mean. Imagine the impact on daily life. Every meal, every bowl of pottage, every loaf of bread depended on water. Brewing ale, mixing mortar, dyeing wool, curing hides. Without water, nothing happened. The shepherd, the mason, the tanner, the cook, all watched the sky, the wells, and the rivers with silent hope, waiting for rain, praying for a full bucket, dreading the day the water ran out. And water was more than just a necessity. It held power, and sometimes terror. Rivers swelled in spring, flooding fields, sweeping away bridges and livestock. Wells went dry in summer heat, their stony throats echoing with desperate calls. Children fell in and vanished, mothers wailed, and the whole village mourned. The memory of drought, of thirst that could not be quenched, stayed with people for generations. A story to frighten, to warn, to humble. Through it all, water shaped the rhythm of the year. The arrival of spring, with its promise of rain and green growth, brought relief, hope, even celebration. In high summer, when streams ran low and wells turned sour, anxiety returned. Autumn's rains refilled barrels and cisterns, and the first frost signaled a time to store, to conserve, to pray the supply would last. Winter, harsh and cold, sometimes froze the wells, trapping villagers in a world of snow, ice, and longing for the thaw. What must it have felt like to live in such a world, to know that each day's safety, each moment of comfort depended on something so fragile, so easily lost? What did people think as they drew their water at dawn, as they bathed their children, as they watched the river rise or shrink away? What hopes and what fears lurked in every drop? And what happened when water failed or sickness came or hope ran thin? Imagine for a moment the heavy silence that settles over a village when the well runs dry. The first sign is always subtle, a slower trickle, a rough edge to the water's taste, an odd silence as neighbors wait longer than usual, scanning the sky for any promise of rain. Anxiety settles on the shoulders of every woman, every elder. Eyes flick toward the sky, the earth, the empty buckets. Conversations shift. How much water is left? How long until the next rain? Who last drew from the well? Fear, rarely voiced, moves beneath each word. And then comes the day when a bucket hits nothing but dust and hollow echoes. No one says it, not at first. They simply walk home slower, buckets empty, faces tight. By evening, the news spreads. Doors bang shut. Children grow restless. Meals are thinner, washing put off. The village feels smaller, quieter, haunted by the possibility that relief may not come. In towns and cities, the story is different, but the danger is just as real. Here, water is drawn from rivers and public fountains, brought by aqueducts, rain barrels, and muddy streams. In wealthier districts, elaborate cisterns collect rainwater. If they are clean, if the roofs above are not caked with the droppings of birds or worse. In the poorer quarters, people jostle for a place at the communal tap. Water sellers haul barrels up steep, slippery streets, charging a precious coin for every sloshing load. Sometimes, fights break out. Sometimes a weak child or an old woman is trampled and no one takes responsibility. Desperation breeds creativity, and necessity becomes the mother of invention. Some dig deeper, risking collapse, suffocation, or poisonous gases. Others turn to old, half-forgotten springs in the woods, cold, sweet, but often choked with weeds or fouled by wild animals. In cities, apothecaries peddle powders and tinctures, promising to sweeten foul water, though the taste is often worse than before. In rural places, the wise women, the herbalists, teach people to boil their water, to steep it with thyme or mint, to strain it through linen and hope for the best. Yet for all their efforts, the shadow of disease lingers. Dysentery, typhoid, and the dreaded bloody flux. They sweep through settlements like wildfire. The causes are unclear, but the suffering is all too real. Fevers, cramps, endless, thirst that no water can quench. People whisper about punishment for sins, about angry spirits, about poisons. Blame is easy, solutions are not. Sometimes the culprit is finally found. A dead animal in the well, a collapsed drain sending filth into the spring. Once in a market town, a tannery's runoff was traced to the strange illnesses plaguing half the children on a single street. The town council convened. The tanner protested he could not move. His father's father had worked that land. But the mothers were unrelenting. The drain was stopped up. The tannery moved. The water ran sweet again, and the story became a warning. Remember what can happen if we're not careful. In the monasteries, water was both a gift and a problem. Monks rose before dawn to wash and pray, to tend the gardens, to care for the sick. Their strict rules called for cleanliness, but the outside world was never far away. Rats found their way into the cellars. Molds grew in the damp. Even the holiest fountain could become a source of death. Chroniclers kept careful notes. Illnesses traced, remedies recorded, prayers said for the sick and the lost. Some monks grew skilled as healers, learning to distill water, to filter it through charcoal, even to build ingenious devices for catching rain and channeling it into barrels, ponds, and gardens. A few towns were blessed with springs so pure they drew pilgrims from miles around. These places became known for their healing water, said to cure the sick and revive the weary. Churches and inns sprang up along the pilgrim roads, built for travelers eager for a miracle or simply a fresh drink. The springs were watched, guarded, tended with reverence and sometimes jealousy. To foul the water was not just a crime, it was a sin. But not every village was so lucky. Most depended on the cycle of drought and rain, luck and labor. The coming of summer was a time of anxiety. Wells ran low, rivers shrank, and barrels grew, lighter each day. It was not only people who suffered. Animals grew thin, fields baked, Even the greenest valley could turn brown and brittle, the promise of harvest shriveling on the stalk. Desperation brought out ancient rituals, old songs sung at dawn, charms dropped into the well, prayers whispered in the dark. Did these things help? No one knew for certain. But in a world with few certainties, every hope was worth trying. When rain finally came, it was met with joy, a festival in miniature. Children ran out to dance in the puddles, their laughter ringing through muddy streets. Buckets and barrels filled, faces turned skyward, and for a little while, relief settled on every heart. But always, at the edge of celebration, was caution. Gather, store, prepare. The next drought was only ever a season away. Meanwhile, the risk of flood never truly vanished. In spring, when snow melted and rains fell hard, rivers could surge without warning. Streets became streams. Wells overflowed, bringing water, but not always safety. Floodwaters tore through fields, destroyed homes, carried off livestock, and left behind a thick, choking mud. The irony wasn't lost. Too little water, too much, and always the struggle to find the balance. Through all this, communities adapted, sharing what they had and learning from one another. A new well, dug deep and carefully, was a project for the whole village. Men digging, women hauling away earth, children bringing food and drink, elders offering advice. When a new spring was found, it was celebrated, blessed by a priest or a wise woman, guarded as closely as any treasure. Still, the dangers remained. There were times when no effort was enough. Wells collapsed. Springs dried up. Epidemics came, claiming the young and the old, leaving holes in the fabric of families and villages that never truly healed. The memory of thirst, of sickness, of helplessness settled in the bones of survivors. Passed down in stories and warnings, in the careful way water was measured and used. Sometimes the solutions were simple. Move the village, dig again, find another stream. But more often the answer was endurance. People stayed where they were, rebuilt, hoped for better seasons. In their daily rituals, the washing of hands, the careful boiling of water, the sharing of a cool drink in the heat, they honored the fragility and the blessing of water, even when it was scarce. By the end of the Middle Ages, things began to change. New ideas, some imported from the distant East, some rediscovered from ancient Roman texts, brought better ways to keep water clean. Engineers in Italian and Spanish cities revived the art of aqueducts. Town councils invested in public fountains, insisting on regular cleaning and repairs. Wealthy families installed lead pipes, not knowing the risks, seeking to bring water straight to their kitchens and courtyards. Even in rural places, the art of well digging became more sophisticated, passed down from master to apprentice. Yet, for all the innovation, daily life remained precarious. Water, that most basic of needs, could never be entirely trusted, never fully secured. Each day began and ended with the same question: is there enough? Is it safe? Will we make it through another season? And so, in the great tapestry of medieval life, water was both thread and pattern, a quiet force shaping, supporting, threatening, and blessing. It connected people across time and space, kings and peasants, monks and mothers, children and elders, all united by the same thirst, the same hope, the same vulnerability. But what happens when the need for water collides with the growing demands of a changing world? As towns grow, as industries rise, as the quest for cleanliness becomes more urgent, how do people adapt, survive, and protect what they need most? So here we are, deep in the Middle Ages, poised at the edge of great change. The search for water, the struggle to keep it clean, the hope that each day's supply would be enough. All of it forms the silent background of medieval life. Yet, now new pressures are bearing down. Cities are growing, markets are bustling, craftsmen are multiplying, and the world is demanding more. More food, more trade, more industry, more people, all of it needing water. Let's walk through a city at sunrise. The streets are alive with sound, the rattle of carts, the shouts of merchants, the barking of dogs. Before shops open, before the church bells toll, someone, always, has already visited the fountain or the well. If you listen closely, you can hear the water dripping into buckets, the soft murmur of voices, the sharp scolding of a mother keeping her children from leaning too far. Water is the day's first transaction, as vital as bread or firewood. But things are not as they were a century ago. The population has swelled, the city walls have grown, waste piles up faster than the streams can carry it away. Tanners, dyers, butchers, each pours refuse into the gutters, trusting the next rain to sweep it away. There are more horses, more pigs, more people crowded into narrow lanes and high, teetering houses. Some days, the river runs brown and foul, a sluggish ribbon of misery slicing through the heart of the city. Public officials try to keep up. Edicts are nailed to doorposts. No offal in the stream. No fish guts near the bridge. Inspectors make rounds, measuring the wells, peering into barrels. Sometimes a culprit is found and punished, fined or pilloried or driven from the town. Sometimes the problems simply shift. A tanner forced out of one district sets up shop in the next. The cycle begins again. A few visionaries see the danger coming. In Milan and Florence, skilled engineers propose grand new aqueducts, bringing water from mountain springs to city fountains. In Paris, royal decrees create a network of public fountains, each supplied by carefully guarded pipes. In London, the Great Conduit is built, a marvel of masonry snaking from a distant spring through fields and suburbs, finally spilling cool, sweet water into the city center. It is a triumph, but it is never quite enough. And outside the cities, the old problems remain. In village after village, the search for water is never-ending. Some communities form water guilds, neighbors banding together to dig new wells, to repair broken buckets, to build simple aqueducts of clay and wood. When disaster strikes, a drought, a poisoned well, a deadly outbreak, help comes from all sides, or sometimes not at all. The loss of water is a calamity, a wound that heals slowly, if ever. Yet amid the hardship there are moments of hope. The arrival of a traveling engineer, a well master, is greeted with gratitude, sometimes even with feasting. His skills are a mystery, his tools rare and treasured. He listens, digs, tests the earth with practiced hands. When he strikes water, there is a cheer and a rush to fill the buckets, and always the hope that this well will last longer than the last. By the late Middle Ages, the quest for cleanliness is gaining momentum, even if most don't yet understand why. Public bathhouses, some grand, some humble, are built in every town. The rich take pride in perfumed water, imported soaps, elaborate rituals. The poor still make do with the old ways. Herbs, ashes, hard scrubbing. But everyone, everywhere, dreams of a world where water is plentiful and clean. Still, the dangers never entirely fade. Each spring brings the risk of flood. Each summer, the threat of drought. Epidemics sweep through, sometimes blamed on tainted water, sometimes on bad air, or the movement of strangers. The wells and streams are watched with suspicion and hope, and the lessons of the past are passed down. Boil what you can, bless what you cannot, never take water for granted. So what do we learn, looking back on these centuries of thirst and hope? The Middle Ages were not an age of ignorance nor an age of endless filth. They were an age of struggle and adaptation, of small victories and quiet loss. The pursuit of water, pure, abundant, sustaining, was a story written in every village, every city, every home. It shaped the fate of kings and peasants, of whole communities and solitary wanderers. Even now, echoes of this struggle remain. In some places, the old wells still stand, a ring of worn stones, cool in the morning shade. Children peer into their depths, imagining what lies below. Elsewhere, the great aqueducts have crumbled, but their memory endures, a reminder of the ingenuity and determination that drove medieval people to seek something better. The legacy of their long thirst is everywhere, in our cities, in our rituals, in the very way we think about safety, health, and home. Every time you turn on a tap, every time you drink from a clean glass, you are living in the aftermath of their centuries-long search. So as we leave this story behind, let's pause for a moment. Let's remember the mothers who waited in line, at the well, the engineers who measured springs, the children who danced in the first rain after a hard summer. Let's reflect on the centuries of patience, persistence, and hope, on all the ordinary lives shaped by something as simple, as essential, as water. What might our ancestors think if they could see us now? Would they envy our abundance? Or worry at our waste? Would they recognize themselves in our daily rituals or find them strange and new? Perhaps the real lesson of the long thirst is this: the most ordinary things, water, work, hope, are never truly ordinary at all. And so, the story of water in the Middle Ages closes, not with a triumph, not with disaster, but with a quiet, ongoing promise. The struggle is never entirely over. The search continues. And as long as we remember what it means to thirst, to wait, to hope, the lessons of the past will always have something to teach us. Picture, if you will, the dawn in a medieval village, the first gray light revealing rooftops layered in dew, the soft clatter of hooves on muddy streets, and the slow awakening of a world bound to the rhythm of the land. You are there, feeling the dampness in the air, smelling the faint scent of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. Beneath it all, a more subtle note lingers, the aroma of bread, sometimes fresh, sometimes stale, always present, always necessary. Bread, in the Middle Ages, was not just food. It was sustenance, status, and security. For most people, life itself depended on the harvest, and the fate of the harvest was always uncertain. Grain was the backbone of daily existence, yet it could be as fickle as the weather, as vulnerable as any living thing. You would see it everywhere, if you looked closely. The small sacks of barley hoarded in a cottage corner, the millstones turning, day and night by the river's edge, the long lines at the baker's door on market day. Bread was breakfast, lunch, and supper, sometimes all at once. For the poorest, it might be all they ate for days on end. Let's start at the field. Picture the wheat growing tall, barley and rye clustered beside it, green turning to gold as summer passes. Medieval farmers knew their work by heart, when to sow, when to weed, when to pray for rain or sun, for mercy, for a decent yield. Every bad season, too wet, too dry, too cold, meant trouble not just for one but for all. During harvest, the whole village came together. Sickles flashed in the light, hands grew calloused, backs ached, and the air filled with chaff and sweat. The grain was cut, bundled, and carted away, first to be threshed, then winnowed, then finally ground into meal. The work was communal, but the results all too often were meager. You might imagine the relief when the harvest was good, the feasts that marked its end. But just as often, there was disappointment. A failed crop meant a winter of fear. People hid their stores, stretched their rations, watched each other carefully. Grain thieves were punished harshly, not just out of malice, but because one stolen sack could mean hunger for an entire family. The mill, too, was at the center of things. Millers held a strange, sometimes resented power. The village depended on them, but trusted them little. They took their fee in grain, sifting a portion from each sack. Stories spread of millers cheating, adjusting the weights, keeping the best flour, adding dust to make up the difference. And yet, without the miller, there could be no bread. Once ground, the flour was brought to the bakehouse. In small villages, women often baked at home, mixing dark loaves from barley, rye, or whatever grain they could spare. In towns, communal, ovens served whole neighborhoods. Families would line up at dawn, dough tucked under arms, each loaf marked with a symbol to distinguish it from the rest. There was comfort in the heat, in the shared labor, in the anticipation of something warm and filling. But not all bread was equal. The wealthy ate wheat bread, fine, white, soft, prized for its purity. The poor made do with black bread, coarse, gritty, sometimes made with more than just grain. In times of scarcity, anything that could be ground up found its way into the dough, beans, peas, even the bark of trees. Bread could be hard, heavy, almost bitter. Still, it was better than nothing. Bread was never just food. It was currency, gift, sacrifice. Rents could be paid in bread or grain, tithes offered to the church, alms given to the poor. A loaf left on a doorstep could be a gesture of kindness or a plea for mercy. Monks baked bread for the sick and hungry. Bakers, when they had extra, might slip a crust to a child or leave a broken loaf for the beggars at the market gate. Bread also carried danger. Poor storage meant mold, sometimes harmless, sometimes deadly. Ergot, a poisonous fungus that infected rye, brought hallucinations, burning pains, even death. In bad years, desperate people ate whatever they could, ignoring the risk. There are records of whole villages falling sick, of dancing plagues and mass hysteria, the hidden price of a meal snatched from ruin. Then there was the question of purity. The law, such as it was, tried to ensure honesty. In many towns, the weight and quality of bread was regulated, bakers punished for short loaves or adulteration. Inspectors came around, measuring, weighing, tasting. The assize of bread, first established in England in the 13th century, set prices and standards, but enforcement was patchy. Bakers were ingenious, stretching flour with dust, ground beans, even chalk or sawdust if no one was watching. Yet a baker caught cheating might face public humiliation, paraded through the streets with a burnt loaf hung around the neck or locked in the pillory. Still, for all its risks, bread was comfort. Families gathered around the hearth, passing, slices from hand to hand, dipping crusts in broth, soaking them in wine, softening the hardest loaves in the morning's pot of porridge. The simple act of sharing bread, breaking, blessing, eating, was a ritual that bound people together. It is easy to romanticize the past, to picture rosy-cheeked children running with fresh loaves, mothers laughing as they knead the dough. The truth was harder. Bread was survival, but survival was uncertain. Every meal was a calculation. How much flour left? How long until the next market day? How many mouths to feed? How many days until the end of winter? The fear of hunger, the memory of famine shaped every decision. And yet, there were moments of joy. A loaf that rose perfectly, a feast day with extra honey or a sprinkle of spice, a wedding or a birth celebrated with bread shaped like a flower or a bird. In those times, bread became more than food. It was hope, a promise of abundance if only for a day. What must it have been like to wake each morning never knowing if the bread would last, to see the crumbs at the bottom of the sack, to weigh them against the hunger in your children's eyes? How did people find the strength to keep working, keep hoping, keep kneading dough day after day? As we leave the village at dusk, the sky, turning to lavender, the smell of bread lingers, sharp, comforting, somehow eternal. The baker's door closes, the hearth fires die down, but still, tomorrow, the work will begin again. The struggle for bread is never over. It is the story of life itself, ordinary, relentless, quietly heroic. But what happened in the years when the grain failed entirely? What did people do when the fields stayed empty, when the mills fell silent, when there was nothing left to grind or bake? How did communities survive famine, and what price did they pay? Famine. The very word lingered in the air like the warning bell of a distant storm. It was always there, on the edge of every conversation, behind every cautious glance at the darkening sky. When the crops failed, the village grew quiet, even before the last sheaf was gathered in. You could feel it in the way people walked, shoulders hunched, eyes low, as if hoping hunger might pass them by. The reasons for failure were many. Sometimes it was rain, too much for too long. Sometimes it was the sun burning fields to dust, or an unseasonable frost, striking when the wheat was still green and tender, cutting down months of labor in a single night. There were pests, too, locusts, beetles, even armies of field mice descending without warning, and sometimes simply bad luck. No matter the cause, the results were the same: thin sheaves, empty barns, and an uneasy hush in every household. At first, people tried to hide the problem. They rationed carefully, slicing the bread thinner, making the gruel stretch another day. Some sold what little they had, hoping to buy grain at market, only to find prices rising with every sunrise, as fear grew and hoarding began. In the best of times, bread was already a careful calculation. In famine, every crumb became a treasure. Neighbors watched each other. Suspicion flared. Was the baker keeping a secret store? Did the miller grind an extra sack for his own family? Were some cheating, hiding grain under the floorboards while others starved? It was a terrible thing, the way hunger turned friends into rivals or worse, into silent strangers. But famine brought something else too. A strange, fierce kind of community. In the darkest months, people pooled what little they had. Sometimes, the church or the local lord offered relief. A sack of barley, a bowl of pottage, a crust left at the door. Priests gave out what they could, blessing the fields, praying for rain, distributing alms from the altar. It was never enough, but even a little hope was better than none. There were records, parish accounts, manorial rolls of desperate measures. Cooks experimented, stretching dough with ground beans, wild roots, even ground up straw. Families dug up acorns and chestnuts, pounding them into bitter, starchy flour. The flavor was harsh, the texture strange, but it filled the emptiness for another day. In truly hard years, stories emerged of people boiling grass or eating bark, anything to push away the sharp ache of hunger. Worse still was the bread that killed. In the scramble for substitutes, the threat of ergot loomed larger than ever. Rye infected with this poisonous fungus brought hallucinations, burning limbs, even convulsions. Some called it St. Anthony's fire, for the way it seemed to set flesh alight. Villages afflicted by ergot poisoning saw their people dance in agony or collapse in fits. It was terrifying, mysterious, and yet, when the choice was poison or nothing, many risked it. The authorities did what they could, which was little. Town councils passed laws against hoarding or price gouging. Lords opened their grain stores to the desperate, sometimes out of pity, sometimes out of fear. Hungry people could be dangerous after all. Bakeries might be ordered to make famine bread, cheap and rough, so everyone might have at least something to eat. But always there was the underlying truth. If the grain was gone, there was no magic to make more appear. What happened then to those who could not make do? Some left, journeying to cities searching for work, for scraps, for charity. Medieval towns swelled with the poor in lean years, refugees sleeping in alleys, begging at church doors, hoping for the generosity of strangers. Others tried to hold on to outlast the winter, trusting that the next harvest might bring relief. Many did not survive. In the Chronicles, the stories are hauntingly similar. A year of plenty, then a year of loss. The deaths are recorded, sometimes with names, more often as numbers, columns of sorrow tallied at the bottom of a page. Families wiped out, children buried in unmarked graves, old men found in empty cottages clutching a handful of dried peas. Famine left scars not just on the body but on the memory of entire communities. And yet, in the middle of suffering, life went on. The fields were plowed again, hope stubborn as the weeds that followed each spring thaw. People adapted, learned, passed down what knowledge they could. They remembered which wild plants could be eaten, which fungi to avoid, how to eke a meal from almost nothing. The resilience was remarkable, generation after generation, battered by hardship but unwilling to give in. Bread changed, too, in these times. It became thinner, denser, sometimes nearly inedible, but it was still bread. At every table, no matter how poor, the meal began and ended with it. A crust, a crumb, a blessing. The sharing of bread became the sharing of suffering and the sharing of hope. To break bread with someone was to say, we endure together, and after famine came the hard work of rebuilding. The survivors gathered the seeds that were left, cleared the fields, and planted once more. They prayed for luck, for rain, for a kinder season. The old and the young joined together, determined to keep going. The memory of hunger hung over every decision, shaping habits and fears for years, even decades. Sometimes famine changed more than just the harvest. It altered the very structure of society. Lords who had failed to protect their people might find themselves challenged, their authority weakened. New leaders could emerge, those who shared their grain, who kept hope alive. In rare cases, famine sparked revolt, as desperate peasants rose up against their masters. The hunger that divided could also unite, turning a village, a region, even a kingdom against those seen as indifferent to suffering. The lesson, repeated over and over through centuries, was harsh but clear. No one was immune. The richest might last a little longer, but eventually everyone felt the pinch. No matter how powerful, no one could eat what the land did not provide. As you walk through the village, the signs are everywhere. The granaries half empty, the loaves growing smaller, the soup growing thinner. The laughter is quieter, the singing rare. Yet here and there, the smell of bread still drifts from an oven. Someone, somewhere is baking, because life must go on, even in the hardest years. In the evenings, families gather, remembering better days. Old stories are told, of the famine that came and went, of the heroism of a neighbor, the generosity of a stranger, the miracle of a single saved loaf. The children listen, half afraid, half comforted. Never waste bread, they are told. You never know when you'll need it most. So, what happened when the hunger finally lifted? When the fields turned green once again? When the first new loaves came out of the oven, what did people feel? Relief, certainly, but also caution, and perhaps a new wisdom born of suffering. What did they learn from the bitter days? Did famine make them stronger, or just more wary? And how did these experiences shape the world that came after? The customs, the prayers, the endless, enduring love of bread. When the famine finally broke, it didn't happen all at once. There was no thunderous announcement, no sudden return to abundance. Instead, the change crept in quietly, first as rumors, then as reality. The air softened. The fields began to green. There was a cautious relief in the way people moved, in the way the village slowly found its voice again. But recovery was slow, and trust, both in the land and in one another, had to be rebuilt, one careful step at a time. It was the women, mostly, who noticed the shift. The first shoots of barley poking through thawed earth, the rye standing tall, and thin, yet alive. Children's eyes brightened as they spotted wild greens in the hedgerows, the promise of something other than root and crust. In kitchens, hands remembered how to knead, how to coax dough from flour and water, even as the memories of bitter substitutes lingered in every movement. A loaf of bread, risen and golden, seemed almost miraculous. It was proof that life, once starved, could be coaxed back from the edge. When the ovens blazed again, the scent of fresh bread rolled through every narrow lane. At first, loaves were modest, smaller, denser, a little darker than before. Still, the taste was precious. Neighbors traded slices and shared meals, less out of plenty and more out of gratitude. Each bite carried both memory and hope, a reminder of suffering, a quiet prayer for better days. The simple act of breaking bread together, once taken for granted, became a ritual of survival, forgiveness, and return. The lessons of famine left deep marks on the village. People changed, as did their habits and customs. Old stories about the value of a single grain of wheat were told and retold, not just to warn but to comfort. Bread was never wasted. Even stale crumbs had a use, added to soups, fed to animals, or tucked away against tomorrow's hunger. Superstition crept into the kitchen. Never cut the last loaf on a Friday. Never leave a piece of bread face down, on the table. Never throw a crust away. Behind every custom was a memory, a silent witness to past hunger. Communal bonds tightened in the aftermath. Those who had shared during the hardest days remembered each other's kindness. Feuds might be forgiven, debts repaid in bread rather than coin. The church, too, became a center of renewed hope. Priests blessed the harvest, offered prayers for the lost, and handed out alms to those still struggling to recover. On holy days, bread was handed to the poor, not as charity alone, but as a symbol that life, though fragile, could endure. could endure. But not everyone returned to the same life. Some who had left in search of food never came back. The poorest, the weakest, those who lost everything. They became stories, names read from lists, ghosts in family memories. The survivors, carrying scars both visible and hidden, moved forward with a new wariness. Even as the world warmed and abundance returned, the lesson was never forgotten. Plenty was a gift, not a guarantee. In some places, famine led to change. Local lords, shamed by the suffering or afraid of unrest, might be more generous in the years that followed. They might lower rents or forgive debts, or build granaries to store surplus grain for lean times. In a few rare instances, communities banded together to form new rules, promising to share, to look out for one another, to never again let a neighbor starve in silence. These were small changes, but over time they shaped the way villages and towns understood themselves. Bread, once again, became the heart of celebration, as well as survival. At weddings, a new bride broke a loaf and shared it with her neighbors. At births, the mother's table held bread and salt, symbols of luck and plenty. During festivals, loaves were shaped into braids or rings, glazed with honey, flavored with rare spices, little luxuries now savored with new appreciation. In the EE, great manors and the humblest huts, the act of sharing bread meant more than just food. It was a promise, a celebration, a remembrance. Still, fear lingered. People watched the sky with caution, worried at the first sign of drought or blight. Children were warned, remember the famine, don't waste what you have. Elders shared tales of the hard days, their voices both proud and mournful. In this way, the memory of hunger became a thread running through every generation, a lesson taught not just with words, but with the daily rituals of the table. Beyond the village, the echoes of famine stretched further. Kings and councils debated new laws to store and distribute grain, to regulate bakers and millers, to punish hoarders and cheats. Chroniclers recorded the dates and numbers, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with indifference. But always, beneath the surface, the story of bread was the story of survival, the endless struggle between abundance and want. Today, you might find it hard to imagine the weight a simple loaf once carried. Supermarkets overflow with bread of every kind: soft white, hearty rye, delicate rolls, crusty baguettes. The notion of famine, of real hunger, feels distant, almost impossible. Yet in kitchens across the world, old habits remain. Bread is shared, saved, never thrown away lightly. Even now, a crust left on a windowsill or a loaf offered to a guest carries a whisper of history. The story of bread in the Middle Ages is the story of human endurance, of how ordinary people, faced with scarcity and fear, found ways to survive, to remember, and finally, to hope again. In every crumb, you can taste not just wheat and water, but the labor, the suffering, and the quiet strength that built a world from the soil up. As you drift through this history, think of the hands that planted the grain, that threshed and ground, that kneaded and baked. Think of the fear and the hunger, but also the resilience. The world has changed, but the lesson remains. Bread is never just bread. It is memory, it is hope, it is the hard-won proof that life can be rebuilt from even the bitterest days. Now, as the village settles in for another night, the ovens cool and the loaves are put away, let this memory linger. What other ordinary things taken for granted today once meant survival? What stories hide in the rituals of your own table? In every slice of bread, the past waits, quiet and steady, ready to be remembered. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our long, winding journey through the unvarnished world of medieval food, a world where bread was precious, meat was a memory, and each meal was a quiet battle won. If you've stayed with me through tales of stale crusts, soured ale, and endless hunger, you've traveled further than most historians ever do. You've touched the daily lives of the forgotten, the quiet millions whose histories are written not in grand victories, but in empty bowls and careful hands. As you drift toward sleep, consider the simple power of enough. Remember the peasant families who stretched every crumb, the alewives who watered their brew with hope and worry, the monks who tended gardens behind thick stone walls, praying for rain and mercy. Remember the silence after a failed harvest, the relief when the ovens glowed once again, the rare joy of a full table shared with neighbors. In our world of abundance, where we fret over choices in brightly lit supermarkets, where fruit from 3 continents sits beside milk chilled to perfection, it's easy to forget that for most of human history, the greatest luxury was a full stomach. Scarcity taught lessons that still echo in the way we gather, share, and give thanks. In every slice of bread, every family meal, every quiet prayer for tomorrow's plenty, the past is present. Perhaps as you settle deeper into rest, you'll carry a little of this story with you. Maybe next time you pass by the bakery or hear the hiss of a kettle, you'll pause and remember the long line of hands that made your meal possible, each one stubborn against hunger, each one hoping for better days. The history of food is the history of survival. It is ordinary and extraordinary, dull and quietly heroic. So as you close your eyes, let gratitude settle in. Let the memory of hard-won meals and the persistence of hope linger a little longer. Rest well, knowing that you are part of an ancient story, a story that continues every time we break bread, give thanks, and dream of tomorrow's feast. Good night.